Inside Texas released their top 10 list of Longhorns ahead of fall camp. And my takeaway is you're going to be pretty surprised by some of the names on this list and where they're ranked on this list.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode, in the first segment, we're discussing Inside Texas top 10 players before fall camp, as well as some additional notes. Like I said, some of the players on this list, where they are, a little bit surprising, but could be very good news for the Longhorns. In the second segment, continuing with the Inside Texas content, they had an article a few days ago, sourced information asking who are the fastest players on this football team, who are the strongest players on this football team, who are the smartest players on this football team, who's most likely to break out in the 2024 football season. We discussed that in the second segment. And then in the last segment, Josh Payton, national football analyst for CBS, host of Late Kick or Late Kick Live, whatever it is, right? He's one of the biggest names in the business. He had a very bold take on the SEC, the playoffs, and the SEC championship this year. We discuss all of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So forever shout out to, Inside Texas for all of the great content they put out, Horns 24/7, just all of the good content creators, that put out content and, help bridge that gap for us between the football team and the fans, right? Or content creators, whoever, right? So Inside Texas puts out a lot of great content, and a lot of that great content makes its way onto Locked On Longhorns as I react to it. So like I said, the first two segments reacting to articles from Inside Texas. The first one was the top 10 players list that just came out, really yesterday or the day before, prior to fall camp, right? With fall camp starting next week, who would you say the top 10 players are on this football team right now? And obviously you have like a good idea of, Kelvin Banks is probably one, Quinn Ewers is really high. But like I said, I was kind of shocked or taken aback by, some of the names when you got to 4 or 5, right? But like I said, this is sourced information. This is from people who are around the team all the time. And, when you look at it, I'll just get into the names, right? And I'll discuss them when I get there. But yeah, this is sourced information. This is coming from people with direct knowledge of the team. So, I think we can take this to our bank. Obviously we still have to have fall camp and, we see what will happen over the course of the season. But, right now, I think this is a pretty accurate list of who has shown the most this offseason. Number one, in terms of top 10 Longhorns on this team right now, I think any top 10 list at the University of Texas that's celebrating the players should include Kelvin Banks, number one. When you just talk about, a freak athlete at the position, his technique, his power, his push, his ability to drive, his ability to move his feet and pass protection. I mean, there's no, it's no secret why he's a top 10 projected draft pick and why this will be his last year on the 40 acres. Just a franchise left tackle at the NFL level that we still have the luxury of watching in the burnt orange and white. So Kelvin Banks is the number one player on this team by far. I wouldn't say by far, but, I think there's, a little gap between him and number two. Steve Sarkisian said last week at SEC Media Days that, if he had to tell any player to emulate one player on this team, it'd be Kelvin Banks. And I think that just continues to echo through everybody that watches him, in practice, on the field, off the field, how he carries himself, whatever. He's the best player on this football team, and he's the one player you would want to emulate if you're trying to understand what Texas football is all about. Number two, Quinn Ewers. One, just from the position he plays the most important position on the field. I think Burt Auburn is a hell of a football player, but he's not going to make any top 10 list because he plays kicker, right? Even though he's one of the best kickers in the country. So when you look at Quinn Ewers, he plays the most important position on the field, but thankfully for us, he plays that position at a really high level. We saw last year the improvements from the 8-5 season to the 12-2 season, and everything I'm seeing in this article, everything I've seen about Quinn Ewers is that he's taken that next step on and off the field, right? On the field in terms of processing, getting through reads, being more consistent with the deep ball and the short and intermediate, being able to run when there's nothing there, but also making plays under pressure, and just taking that profit, right? Not holding the ball too long, not taking sacks, not putting your offense in a position to where they're behind the chains, right? That's on the field. And then off the field, just the leadership, right? Walking in the room like he owns it. We've heard that now, right? Like he's the quarterback. He's the leader, right? And people want to follow him because they know they can go to war with him and win games. So Quinn Ewers is number 2, plays the most important position on the field, plays it at one of the highest levels in college football right now. And I expect that this year, right? A lot of people thought we would see it as soon as Quinn Ewers stepped on the field. But I believe this year is the year that we see Quinn Ewers really put it all together and take it to the next level. Number 3, Isaiah Bond. I'm still pretty much on track with this list, right? I think if you ask, which 3 players on this team were most likely to be All-Americans this season, it would be Kelvin Banks, right? Because, he's just probably the best left tackle in the country. It'd be Quinn Ewers. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the country in this offense. And then, of course, it would be his number 1 target in Isaiah Bond, right? When you look at it, Isaiah Bond had like 670 receiving yards last year, but he made some of the biggest plays in college football. And every time he got deep, he was a threat to hit his head on the goalpost. Now you bring him over into Steve Sarkisian's offense. The number 1 reason he said he transferred was because, right now he's making NFL draft type decisions, right? And this is the type of offense you want to be in right before you enter the NFL draft. Just look at how that opportunity worked out for Adonai Mitchell, even though he got drafted a little bit lower, right, than, he should have because of some BS reports that came out. His 11 touchdowns this year and, what he was able to do in this offense certainly boosted his draft stock, right? And so Isaiah Bond is looking to do the same thing. And I think in this offense this year that I think will be top 5, should be top 10 minimum with Quinn Ewers' growth, with Steve Sarkisian's growth, and the way that you just can't load up on Isaiah Bond because everything else around him at tight end, wide receiver, and running back. I think Isaiah Bond is going to have a special season, right? And he has all the potential in the world to be first team All-SEC or All-American. So if you're looking at the 3 best players on this team, it would make sense that they all have the ability to be the best at their position in college football this year. And I think Isaiah Bond, Quinn Ewers, and Kelvin Banks, those are somewhat realistic assertions for those players, especially Kelvin Banks. Number 4 is where it gets a little freaky, right? Number 4 is where I was like, whoa. Number 4 is Alfred Collins. They have Alfred Collins as the 4th best player on this football team heading into fall camp. Now, just in terms of pure talent, I don't think that surprises anybody, right? He's 320 pounds. He's fast. He's strong as hell. He can jump. We've seen him intercept passes. He can really move like an edge rusher as a 320-pound defensive tackle, right? So I think all the talent in the world is there, right? And, like this article says, he didn't come back to be a 5th-round pick. But the question at times, the motor, the consistency, the effort. But everything we've heard this offseason seems like he's putting it together, right? This is a contract year. And like we saw last year for Byron Murphy and T'Vondre Sweat, it was contract years for them. They turned into All-Americans. What we're seeing right now with them listing Alfred Collins as the 4th best player on this football team tells me that he understands what's at stake this year. And his talent has always been there. But now that motor, that drive, that passion, and that effort is accompanying the talent. And that can make him one of the scariest players in football this year. Also, when you look at it, I think our ceiling directly is determined by players like Alfred Collins, and spoiler alert, Trey Moore is number 5 on this list. When you look at it, T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy were All-Americans last year. That pushed our ceiling into being a playoff team and a national championship contender last season. I think if T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy just had good seasons, we probably win the Big 12, but don't make the playoffs, right? This year, if Alfred Collins and Trey Moore are truly 2 of the 5 best, even 6 best players on this football team, then Texas is a legitimate national championship contender because you're going to have 2 players on that defensive line that can absolutely wreck shop at any point in the game. And that was the biggest reason why Michigan completely took Washington out of the game in the national championship. So if Alfred Collins is the 4th best player on this football team right now, and Trey Moore is the 5th best player on this football team right now, based on what they can bring to the table, that only elevates the ceiling of this football team when they get deeper into the postseason, hopefully vying for a national championship. And that's what this list says, right? Alfred Collins and Trey Moore, they expect them to be, borderline dominant players for the Texas Longhorns football team this year. Number 6, Jahdae Barron. He's been a bit limited over the offseason. I didn't expect him to be the number 1 corner on this list. I would have gone Malik Muhammad. But when you talk about his versatility, what he brings to the table in terms of leadership, all the different positions he can play, the way he can cover all across the middle of the field and the short areas of the field, the way he can blitz, the way he can tackle. And, deep speed and deep coverage was an issue for him last year, but I think he'll be better at it this season. He did deal with some injuries last year. So when you talk about Jahdae Barron, he's just somebody that can do a little bit of everything on this defense, on this football team. Certainly makes sense that he would be number 6 in terms of what he can bring in terms of value. Number 7, they have Anthony Hill. I'm bullish on Anthony Hill. I probably would have had Anthony Hill at like number 3, right? You know what I mean? But I understand that he changed positions this offseason based on this article. They say there were some growing pains. It did take him a little bit longer to, kind of get accustomed and really just get comfortable in that Mike position. And, I understand that when you go from playing off ball to that Jalen Ford position, being on ball and really being the true leader of the defense. But I just think with Anthony Hill's talent level, his work ethic, his football IQ, even if he's had growing pains, even if he's transitioning into a new position, he'll still be one of the best players in college football, period, offensively, defensively, or special teams this year. And one of the biggest reasons why Texas can be a national championship contender. Number 8, Cedric Baxter or Jaden Blue. I personally would have Jaden Blue above Cedric Baxter right now. But when you know how important the running back position is to Steve Sarkisian's offense, and when you look at this offensive line, they're going to be running behind, and then everything that, Quinn Ewers and all the receivers and tight ends will take the pressure off, right? Like I didn't word that right, right? But everything around the running backs will make it so easy for the running backs to have holes to run through. You know what I mean? Like when you look at this Steve Sarkisian offense and what we have, you're going to want to limit the pass, right? You're not going to come into games saying we need to stop Cedric Baxter and Jaden Blue. You're coming into games saying we need to stop Quinn Ewers, Isaiah Bond, Ryan Wingo, and then the list of wide receivers. I'm not going to list them all, right? So that's going to create open running lanes, right, and empty boxes for Cedric Baxter and Jaden Blue. I think they'll both be great this season. We really don't know, who's the true number 1 and who's the true number 2 or how the carries and snaps will be divvied out. But either way, right? Cedric Baxter and Jaden Blue, I think they're both going to have elite seasons. I would have Jaden Blue ahead of Cedric Baxter right now, just a little bit. But I think even though I would have Jaden Blue just a little bit higher than Cedric Baxter, they both have the potential to be top 10 running backs in the country this year because they're both going to get the opportunity to shine. Number 9 is Jake Majors, leader on this team, one of the most consistent players on this team, one of the best centers in the country, and certainly the glue of this offensive line. And, yeah, he's going to be one of the biggest reasons this Texas football team is great this year. Number 10 was another surprise for me, Barron Sorrell, right? But it makes sense, right? He's been a really good edge for us the last couple of years. He's a veteran. The article says he does everything right? And then I think on the other side of, Trey Moore, getting Colin Simmons ready to be an everyday player at this level, I do think Barron Sorrell has the potential to have a really good season. Now, here's some kind of notes that are also interesting as well. They said, a case could have been made for Matthew Golden or Silas Bolden to be on the top 10 list, but Silas Bolden just got to campus in May, and Matthew Golden was dealing with some injuries over the course of the offseason. But they believe that, at certain points in the season, they could be top 10 players on this team. They said wait on August intel, but DJ Campbell is a candidate to break out, a 5-star in the 2022 class. He certainly has the opportunity to make this his best season in the contract year. Others to watch are Andrew Makuba, Malik Muhammad, and Ethan Burke. Even Gunnar Helm, Amari Niblack, or Michael Tav could be considered top 10 players on this team. So that just tells you about the talent and the depth that they had a top 10, and then our honorable mention is damn near 10 players, right? And then they said if Arch Manning had to play right now, he would be top 10. He would not be number 2, but he'd be one of the 10 best players on the team. That's pretty spicy. Then I asked a follow-up on Malik Muhammad, thinking he would already be top 10, me as well, right? He'll be on an island this year and draw a lot of tough receivers. Let's hear how he does versus Bond this August. So my biggest takeaway from that article is regardless of how you feel about the top 10 players they listed, there's no doubt in my mind or your mind that, like Steve Sarkisian said, this is probably the most talented team we've had since 2021, right? And this team should make a lot of noise this year, in conference, out of conference, and in the playoffs. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into, some of the superlatives, right? Who are the fastest players on this team? Who are the strongest players on this team? Who are the smartest players on this team? Et cetera, et cetera. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, so getting into the second segment, like I said, this is another article written by Inside Texas. This was, I think, over the weekend or on Friday, but kind of, I think, going from some fan questions that they had on their live or, maybe just an interesting content idea. You do want to know who, the smartest, fastest, strongest players are on the team or whatever. And, I mean, that obviously translates directly to wins, right? So When we look at it, or I think the first question is not even necessarily the strongest, right? It is question, who are the biggest gym rats on this team, right? So who are the biggest, who do you got to keep out of the gym, right? Who works out too much on this football team? And the answer to that question is directly from Inside Texas. If by gym rats you mean they go the hardest in the weight room, it would be Baron Sorrell, right? That's probably why he made the top 10 list when I didn't expect him on there. Mo Blackwell, that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, right? Steven from Fanatic Perspective calls him game speed for a reason. That boy will put his body on the line to tackle somebody. So of course he go in there and get strong. David Bender, if you ever seen his physique, right? That should be no surprise as well. David Bender's in there getting it in that weight room. And then Anthony Hill doesn't eat weights like those guys, but it doesn't matter what you put on the bar, he'll get it back up, right? I just love Anthony Hill, right? He might be my favorite player on this team, man. I love Anthony Hill. If by gym rats you mean they try to win every rep at all cost, it's probably Mo Blackwell. Once again, game speed, you know what I mean? DeAndre Moore, which is really cool to see, especially at a wide receiver, just that competitiveness and trying to win every rep at every cost. And then Michael Taft, right? You don't go from being a walk-on to being an everyday player for this football team, especially the Texas Longhorns football team and their position they're in right now, without being a competitor, right? Without trying to win every rep, without doing whatever it takes to win every rep. And that's why Michael Taft, once again, has gone from a walk-on to being an everyday football player for this football team. What about the fastest players, right? Every time I ask, it seems there are more players added to the list. Who are the fastest players on this Texas Longhorns football team? This is per Inside Texas. If we tried to go with the 10 fastest, that would be tough. But if we're listing the fastest players, you have to mention Silas Bolden, Isaiah Bond, DeAndre Moore, Ryan Niblett. So essentially the whole wide receiver room, right? Jaden Blue, of course, Ryan Wingo, Matthew Golden. That's crazy, right? Like essentially the wide receiver core. That's what he just named. That's just offense, and I'm probably forgetting someone. Defense, you'd have to go Gavin Holmes. He's probably one of the fastest guys overall. Warren Robertson, Jahdae Barron. I'm not sure about that one, right? But he was injured last year, right? But I love Jahdae. I'm not sure if he's one of the fastest players on the team. Jalen Gilbo, and throw Xavier Philsami in there too. So some interesting names, right? Especially on the defensive side. If you're asking who's the fastest players, Gavin Holmes. I think I probably could have guessed that one. Jahdae Barron. Not sure about that one. Like I said, I love Jahdae. Warren Robertson, Jalen Gilbo, and Xavier Philsami. Interesting. So, I mean, if we got speed in the secondary, we shouldn't be getting burnt in the secondary, right? All right, let's transition to the smartest football players on this football team. Who are the smartest players on this football team per Inside Texas? This is sourced information, of course. Quinn Ewers, right? Obviously, the starting quarterback from one of the best teams in the country. He better be one of the smartest players on this football team, right? Now, we do have helmets, coach to helmet communication. So I guess we could do the Sean McVay, Jared Goff, and we could just tell Quinn Ewers what to run and where to look. You know what I mean? But, you better be one of the smartest players on this football team if we expect Texas to be really good this season. Arch Manning, of course. I mean, you didn't even have to write that down, right? Eli Manning, Peyton Manning, Archie Manning, right? For walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? So you would think Arch Manning would be the descendant of those three Mannings, right? And they were all really smart. Of course, Arch is Jake Majors. You didn't have to write that down, right? Leader on this football team, glue of this offensive line, leader of this, offensive line, the quarterback of this offensive line for the last 3+ years. Jake Majors just brings everything to the table. And you saw in limited action last year, right, where we lost Jake Majors, and it felt like the offense and the offensive line just went into disarray. We've been trying to replace him damn near every year since I started this podcast, and every year he just comes out and continues to be one of the biggest assets, biggest literally, on this football team. Kelvin Banks, you don't get projected to go top 10 in the NFL draft. You don't come in as a true freshman and dominate players like Will Anderson without being a very smart football player. And that's the thing about Kelvin Banks that, makes him so special and makes him, a future perennial I don't want to say perennial all pro player, but perennial Pro Bowl player. And I think he'll make some, all pro teams in his career too, is because the physical is amazing, right? Like even if he didn't have the football IQ, he could just get by on the physical. The fact that he has the physical plus the IQ makes him an all-time level player. Jahdae Barron, of course, right? You know what I mean? Just his versatility and what he brings to that nickel position, his ability to blitz, his ability to time routes, his ability to make tackles in the backfield, his ability to shoot gaps, dodge blocks, whatever, right? That all comes from football IQ, right? He's one of the smartest players on this football team. And him being in Pete K's system since 2021, right, confirms that he's one of the smartest players on this football team because he knows exactly why Pete Kwiatkowski wants to do things. He knows exactly where Pete Kwiatkowski wants him to be, and he knows exactly what Pete Kwiatkowski wants to accomplish with every single play and every single scheme on defense. Anthony Hill, Barron Sorrell, we've already talked about them, kind of being in the gym, but, just the careers they've paved for themselves at the University of Texas, even Anthony Hill only being 1 year, Barron Sorrell being 3-4 years now, that has to come with football IQ. And then Andrew Makuba, even though they say he hasn't 100% grasped the playbook yet, which I'm wondering, like, damn, what are they teaching the safeties, right? Like, if Andrew Makuba still don't know the playbook, like, what are we teaching the safeties, right? Maybe that's why they were so lost last year. Like, why is the safety defense so complex? But either way, they're saying he's one of the smartest players on the team, even though he hasn't 100% picked up the playbook yet. And they say which players are most likely to break out. Ryan Wingo is probably too obvious at this point. But Silas Bolden, Juan Davis, a name we've heard a lot this offseason, which would be really cool in the tight end room. Don't know how much opportunity you can give him, because Gunnar Helm and Amari Niblack are certainly going to get a lot of opportunity. But Juan Davis sounds like a player that they're ready to see this year in heavy doses. Javion Cole, we keep hearing that name, but we're also in a, current battle between him and Gavin Holmes. So we'll see how that plays out in training camp. And then Kobe Black. A lot of people feel like, he's going to be a backup, obviously, to Malik Muhammad. There are opportunities for Kobe Black to get on the field this year, and they feel like he's been progressing every day and is a long way. Not that he came in bad or anything, right? But just, as a true freshman, he's improved so much since he got to campus in January, now in July, ahead of the season. A quick word from our sponsors, and we get into Josh Pate from CBS, right? From what's the name of his podcast? I wrote it down. The Late Kick Podcast, right? Has some really interesting takes on who he thinks will be in the SEC championship game this year and who he thinks will make the playoffs from the SEC. So we're going to discuss that next. All right, so getting out of here, third segment, talking about Josh Pate, one of the best in the business. I haven't tuned into his content a whole lot, just because as a content creator myself, I feel like if you listen to too many other people's voices, you start to internalize them, and you start to become a product of everybody you listen to. So I like to keep my thoughts. But yeah, Josh Pate is really good at what he does, right? Obviously, he's one of the best in the business. When I have heard him, he's always been profound. And I think he does a really good job of, providing content for college football fans, right? And, explaining what he sees on the field or what he sees behind the scenes in a way that, provides information to college football fans at a high level, but also provides it in a way that they can understand, right? So I think Josh Pate is, like I said, one of the best in the business. He had a show the other day where he was talking about, who he thought would be in the SEC championship game and who he thought would be in the playoffs from the SEC. And when you look at it, there's going to be 12 teams in the playoffs, and I think there's either 7 or 8. I have to go back and confirm right now that there's no Pac-12. There's either going to be 7 or 8 at-large bids in terms of making the playoffs, right? So he has 4 teams from the SEC making the playoffs: Texas, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Alabama. I don't think that's crazy at all, right? Obviously, one of these teams probably, or one team from the SEC is going to win the championship. They're going to be a lot. So then if you tell me 3 out of 7 or 3 out of 8 at-large teams are going to be SEC teams, with the SEC being the best, conference in college football, that certainly makes sense to me. Just like if you look at it last year, Texas, well, I guess Texas wasn't an SEC team, but essentially they're an SEC team, and Alabama made it, and then Georgia was right on the cusp, right? So, yeah, 4 SEC teams making the college football playoffs this year, not really as spicy. Now, he has Ohio State over Texas in the Natty, right? And that would absolutely crush me if Texas got to the national championship game again and lost it again, right? That would be the second time in a row. But I think Ohio State is an amazing team, but we watched Will Howard for years at Kansas State. He just doesn't really move the needle for me. Like, I think Ohio State certainly has a national championship roster, but I think in the moments where you need your quarterback to be the best player on the field or make a championship level play, I'm just not sure that Will Howard can deliver that. So that's why I'm kind of tempering my, expectations on Ohio State a little bit, just because I think that their quarterback position is not amongst the elite, but we'll see. Now, what was spicy about what Josh Pate says is that he's picking Ole Miss and Texas to play in the SEC championship game with Texas winning it, not Georgia. in the SEC championship game. And initially, everybody would look at that like it's crazy, right? Because everybody has Georgia as the number one team in the country. They're already penciled into the SEC championship game. They're already penciled into the national championship, right? It's blasphemy at this point to say that Georgia may not be one of the best two teams in the SEC. But here's why Josh Pate might be a genius, and here's why it's a realistic possibility. When you look at it, Texas and Ole Miss both play Georgia this season at home, right? Would it be crazy for Texas to beat Georgia at home? No. Would it be crazy for Ole Miss to beat Georgia at home? No. Then at that point, Georgia would have 2 SEC losses. Outside of Georgia, the highest ranked SEC teams Texas will play, and if we look at that preseason poll that just came out, are Oklahoma and Texas A&M. Like, I think they were ranked, 7th and 8th in the SEC respectively, or 8th and 9th. So if Texas can get past Georgia, even though you play Oklahoma before that, Oklahoma and Texas A&M are your next 2 biggest tests in the conference. They're nowhere near the level of Georgia, right? When you look at Ole Miss's schedule, outside of Georgia, the highest ranked teams they'll play are Oklahoma and LSU. Now, LSU is better than Oklahoma and Texas A&M, but Ole Miss beat LSU last year and should beat them again this year, right? And then Ole Miss, if they're playing Ole Miss football, right, they should beat Oklahoma as well. So outside of Georgia, Ole Miss really doesn't have another test that equates to that Georgia game. If you can beat Georgia, Texas, and Ole Miss, the rest of your schedule is downhill. Now, when you look at Georgia's schedule, right, just in terms of conference play, they have to go to Texas, they have to go to Ole Miss, they have to go to Alabama, and then they also play Tennessee at home, right? So they have to play 4 teams in the top half of the SEC voted on by the media, 3 of those on the road, right? So there is a scenario where Texas and Ole Miss end up with 1 SEC loss and Georgia ends up with 2 or more based on their schedule. If Texas can beat Georgia and Ole Miss can beat Georgia, there's a very realistic scenario that Texas and Ole Miss only end up with 1 SEC loss. And like Josh Pate predicted, they would be in the SEC championship game. And like Josh Pate predicted, Texas would beat Ole Miss in that scenario. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.